I had a lot of people thinking that this might be Bree traveling through the stones in the preview clips for episode 15, so let's talk about it. As always, this will have spoilers for the books in the show, so if you are looking to avoid those, please do keep on scrolling. So, as per usual, I don't know how much of the show will include book plot, but I know people love to hear what happens in the book so they can compare and contrast. So I wanted to make this video talking about Bree and the course of action she takes leading up to going back through the stones. I touched upon this a little bit when I made my last video about Bree reading the letter from Frank, and I mentioned that after she reads the letter from Frank, her and the kids travel to California. Now, in Boston, in November in 1980, Joe Abernathy in the books receives a letter from Brianna, and he notes that the stamp on this letter is an American stamp as opposed to a British one that he is used to getting. And he jokingly says, "I hope you brought the kids to Disneyland. What are you doing in America?" And sure enough, inside the letter is a picture of the kids at Disneyland. But there's also a letter from Brianna which tells Joe that she is taking the kids to go see Grandma and Grandpa and asks for him to help her take care of things while she is gone, and notes that there are instructions inside of a box that she sends him as well. So Joe knows that Claire is back in time and is able to deduce that this means she is going to be time traveling with the kids at some point in the near future. Now, in chapter 95 of Written in My Own Heart's Blood, we read about Bree making preparations in the event that she has to disappear, and grapples with how do you make plans for going and disappearing back in time, but also not knowing if you're going to need to come back and wanting to make sure that your things are still here, or the possibility that 20 years from now your kids might return without you and need things in order to pick up their life here again. So she's at the post office trying to send out all of these letters, including the one that she sends to Joe. And while she's there, she looks in her P.O. box and sees a letter inside of it. She takes the letter out to her rental car and sees that it's a letter from Joe with another letter inside of it that is clearly from the 18th century. It smells familiar to her, and it has Roger's handwriting on it. A letter from Joe, he explains that an estate agent in Scotland who is taking over Lallybroch with her was trying to move the furniture out of the home for the new tenant, but they couldn't get the big desk in the study out, so they hired an antiques guy to take it apart. And while they were taking it apart, they found a bunch of Queen Victoria stamps, which Bree had found when she was looking through the desk, and also this letter inside of it. The letter is addressed to Brianna in her full name and sealed with Roger's thumbprint, which she can tell because he has a little scar on his thumb back when he was cutting something back in time that she recognizes. And the date on the letter is November 15th, 1739. So Brianna is finally able to figure out where in time Roger is and is wondering how in the heck he ended up so far back. Now, Roger kind of chooses to speak almost in code in this letter and says that he found Jeremiah, but not the one he was looking for, and met Brian Fraser and thinks Brianna would have liked him. He also mentions that he met Blackjack Randall and found RAF, Royal Air Force identification tags, and is with Buck still looking for Jemmy, but is also trying to find the owner of the dog tags, which Brianna will be able to figure out is his father. So in his own way, Roger has left word for her about his whereabouts that she would then find in the future. After she reads the letter from Roger, she goes back to where her and the kids are staying, and she starts to write down more information into the practical guide for time travelers that her and Roger have been working on, and includes a few hypotheses. The first one includes the ley lines being a big part of the ability to time travel. The second one is about requiring a gemstone to pass through. And Joe, she remembers, interestingly, had a patient who was an archaeologist in Orkney who discovered stones with tonal qualities. So basically, if you hit them with a piece of wood or another stone, they make a musical note, and maybe the vibrations that a gemstone has works in tandem with the vibrations of the stone as you're traveling. I thought this was interesting because we know that Michael Connolly was an archaeologist in Orkney. So Roger knew him, and now we're potentially getting information that Joe knew him as well. So the man is popping up in a few different places. The third hypothesis is that the stones can help kind of guide you as to when and where you emerge, but there's little evidence to support that because there's been so many different scenarios that Bree can't really definitively say that this is true. Now, in chapter 97, which is the beginning of December in 1980, Bree arrives in Boston with the kids, and they spend the dinner catching up with Joe and his wife, and Bree's finally able to kind of relax being in the company of someone she trusts. And when Mandy goes to bed, her and Joe talk through whether or not Bree should be going back through the stones in America so that she can go back to Claire and Jamie and then leave the kids with them to go find Roger. And kind of the logistics of that, even though she knows if she were to bring the kids back there in that time period, the war is happening and that would be dangerous. She also lets Joe read the letter from Roger. And interestingly, in that passage, Joe makes a reference about Doctor Who and how this feels very Doctor Who to him. And that's actually an Easter egg because Diana Gabaldon wrote Outlander after being inspired by the Doctor Who show. During her and Joe's conversation, Jemmy is with them, and Bree points out that Jemmy and Mandy obviously can kind of sense one another, and Mandy has said that she can hear Jemmy in her head. And so Bree asks Jemmy if he can hear Roger in that way, and he very simply says, "Sure, can't you?" The next day, December 9th, Bree and Joe end up testing Jemmy and Mandy's connection to see just how far apart they can go before they don't feel each other anymore. And she's able to figure out that it's about 4 miles. And Mandy can actually feel Jemmy a lot further of a distance than Jemmy can feel her. So Mandy is a lot more powerful in this way than Jemmy is, even though obviously they both are. Jemmy can also sense Brianna, but only a short distance apart. Meanwhile, Mandy was able to sense Brianna the same distance that she was able to feel Jemmy. So again, just reiterating that she is a little bit more powerful than Jemmy. Bree then explains to Joe that she's made up her mind that she has to travel to Scotland and go through the stones in Scotland, so that she's in Scotland already, just because it's December at this time. So she would have to wait until the spring to get on a boat and travel to Scotland via boat, and she wouldn't put the kids through that if she didn't have to. But Joe is a little concerned, obviously, because going back to Scotland is dangerous at this point in time when there are people actively looking for her and trying to chase after them. In the middle of the night, Jemmy and Mandy both wake up kind of early, and Bree actually tells them about Frank and explains that he was different, but also a soldier, a writer, a scholar like Roger, and that he took care of people, which was the most important thing. And Jem asks Bree if they can see Grandpa Frank before he falls back asleep, which kind of gives Bree a little bit of an uneasy feeling. Then in chapter 103, Bree is writing in the Practical Guide for Time Travelers again, pointing out that they're planning on traveling during the winter solstice. Fiona is going to meet them in Inverness, bring them to her house to change into their garb, and then bring them to the stones. And when they get to the stones, Lionel Menzies is there again, helping them to escape. He warns them that Rob is on his way to get them and watches them try and go through the stones. Mandy runs off ahead of time and tries to go through beforehand, but her stone disintegrates and so does Jemmy's. And so Lionel gives them his ring in order to pass through the stones and watches them do it. Mandy and Jem can both feel Roger at this point, and that is what guides them to his time, and they end up in Scotland, and we pick up shortly after with them at Lallybroch. While they're there, Jamie's dad, Brian, actually sees Brianna walking down the hill and thinks that it's his wife, Ellen, and then he sees Jemmy and thinks that it's his son, Willie. Roger then shows up at Lallybroch. It had been about 6 weeks since he had last seen Brian Fraser at this point, and when he gets there, he's reunited with Jem and Mandy. So that's how things play out in the books. I'll be very curious how much or how little of that ends up in the show.